All right, everybody. Welcome to our week of sports nutrition. I'm excited that you're all here. And last class, if you weren't here in the intro, basically what we did is we just went over the syllabus. That's all in the welcome video. I'm not going to go back through that. We got a lot to dive into today. So if you're ready to go, type a yes or a yes in the chat. Give me some energy. I know it's hard to do through a computer screen. Yes, yes. Give me a smiley face, an emoji, something. All right, talk to me. Talk to me. All right. So let's get rocking and rolling. So last time we just got barely into the material, didn't we? We said there are, I call them my sexy six nutrients. We got carbs, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, water. We know of those six, which three provide the body with energy. Just type in one. One of the six that provide energy. Okay. Carbs. Okay. And I know when you're typing in the chat, sometimes it doesn't go well. That's okay. Yeah. Fat. What's another one? I'm missing one. Somebody type it in. I got a large number of you. Yeah. Protein. If you have to. The body doesn't like to use protein, but it will if it needs to. Okay. So just realize that. We'll get into this as we go through. We talked about what a nutrient is. We said, hey, it's substances we find in foods that contribute to your health. And we said we have some of these nutrients that are essential. And by essential, what does that mean? Essential just means that our body can't make it. We got to get it from the foods that we eat. And so, and I know that, and we don't, they use here in California, they do use some paper bags. You have to pay for them. You might know that in California, you got to pay for your bags. So we always take our bags in. How many of you have your grocery bag? It looks like that. Got some healthy, got a few canned goods, got some veggies in there. Hopefully you are doing better than me when I was your age and eating, I used to eat a bunch of crap. We'll get into all that as we go through. But we said that all of these nutrients do specific things, right? Either when you say energy, I think last time you popped in there and said, yeah, those are mainly carbs, but the other two nutrients can provide, fat provides a lot of energy. Protein, we really don't want it to because it does a lot of other stuff. Those other three that you see there, growth, repair, maintenance, that's all a big function of protein. Okay. And then I mentioned the fact that, yeah, our body likes to use real food. So just know that if you have an opportunity, eat real food when you can. And that includes, fresh fruits and veggies. That includes even canned or frozen. We're doing a lot of that here in California. And you might be surprised to know that frozen veggies have just as much nutrients, maybe even more than raw, depending on where it was picked and how long it takes to get on the truck and get to the grocery store and you purchase it. So but real food is important. And then we got into carbohydrate. We said carbo means carbon, hydrate means water. And we have two varieties. In general, what we say is that we have complex and simple carbohydrate. And the simple carbohydrate requires little, if any, digestion. And the complex is the bonds are more complicated, a little more complicated. There are more bonds. And so there has to be a little more digestion that's required. But ultimately, all of these carbohydrates are going to be broken down to their simplest form. And I don't know if we mentioned this last time. What's that called, somebody? What do we break down carbohydrates to? What's the smallest? And this is important for all of us. Yeah, glucose. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, this is where we dive into the controversies. You'll see in all your texts that, you have to have 130 grams of carbohydrate to feed the brain and nervous system. But we even mentioned like people that do low carb eating, they may not be getting 130. And so just know that it really does depend on the individual and what their goals are. If you got an athlete that's training a lot, then yeah, you're going to need some carbohydrate because, this is important, right? If you've had this in your notes from last time, the only function of carbohydrate is to provide the body with energy. When you look at fat, it does other stuff. When you look at protein, it mainly does other stuff. So just know the main job of carbohydrates provide the body with energy. And it doesn't do a whole lot else. And we kind of joked around with where do carbs come from? Again, they don't come from a stork. It doesn't drop them on your plate. We said they come from plants. And then we kind of finished up with this, and it may have surprised you that, the guidelines around eating surprisingly slanted towards carbohydrate. And like I said, if you're exercising a lot, that's probably not a bad thing. But if you're really, really super sedentary, having just a bunch of carbs on your plate, maybe not the best approach. So that's where you end up having to maybe cut back on your calories, cut back on your carbs in particular. And of the nutrients, and we can get into this, and when we get into the carbs individual chapter, this is the nutrition basics part that you should probably already know is that, but I'll throw some things in like this. Think about carbohydrates as a dial. And when you're exercising a lot, you can turn that dial up. But when you're not exercising, it's the nutrient that you really adjust the most with your eating. Okay. You're going to adjust fat a little bit and protein some, but the carbohydrate is really the one that you're going to want to adjust based on how much work you're doing, how much volume of training. And we can get into that. But this is what it looks like. This is our simple carbohydrate. Remember, we said we had two types, complex and simple, and it is glucose. Everything in our body is eventually broken down to glucose, but we also have a term, a fancy term for these. They're called monosaccharides. How many of you have heard this before in the chat? Just type it in. You've heard of a monosaccharide. We basically there's our three 6-carbon sugars. It's our basics. We got glucose, galactose, and fructose are the three. And when you put two of these monosaccharides together, you get a disaccharide. You should know that, right? Pairs of monosaccharides. So you put these together and you get sucrose, you get lactose, you get maltose. And basically, when you put a glucose and a fructose, and I probably have this on a slide coming up, glucose and a fructose, you get sucrose. When you have a glucose and a galactose, it makes lactose. And where do we get? And so what's sucrose, somebody? Type it in. You know this. What's another word for sucrose? Or unmute. Just tell me what it is. What's sucrose? Okay, it's not artificial. Good question. I love it. Good guess. What's sucrose? Yeah, sugar. It's table sugar, right? It's table sugar. Lactose you find where? I've got a little probably here in my coffee, right? Where do you find lactose? In milk. Good. Dairy, yes. And then maltose. Some of my favorites here. Maltose is, when you look, it's a two glucose molecules. Where do you find maltose? Anybody? A common one? We don't talk about this one much. When you think malt, what comes to your mind? Malt liquor. Yeah, alcohol. Malt liquor. It is simple sugar. So when and I used to do this, so heaven forbid I tell you all my stories, and I will do that in here, throw myself under the bus. When I drink that 6-pack, I don't know, 12-pack back in the day, right? That's why people gain weight when they drink a bunch of alcohol in most cases, is because they're taking a bunch of simple sugar in the form of this maltose and alcohol, but they're also usually eaten with it as well. And the calories you eat in the foods, is stored, because all the calories that you consume, think about it, if you eat, how many calories, let's just be honest, are in a 6-pack of even light beer? You're talking 600, 700, 800 calories, maybe even more. You're kicking back a 6-pack on the weekend. Well, all those calories that you're consuming during, because you're usually eating along with it, is stored, right? Because your body will use what energy it has available first. So just know that how these work. All right, and simple carbohydrates get a little bit of a bad rap in that they tend to be higher in calories. And so I was talking about the alcohol. They lower in nutritional value. You find them in your sodas. You find them in your breads, that cheap bread that you buy, right? Your muffins. I'm just looking through here. You find them in your French fries, potato chips, along with other. And that's another thing too. One of the reasons in these unhealthy foods, you're going to get some, like potato chips. You got lots of carbohydrates there, but you also have lots of fat too. That's another reason that these simple carbohydrates, when you eat them, a lot of times you're eating them with a bunch of fat as well, and they have a lot of calories. Not always, but they do. And what I'm going to say around this is that simple carbohydrates have their place. Like before, during, and after exercise, we're going to talk about this. Simple carbohydrates are really important, right? Because you need that blood sugar, you need that glucose, you need that energy. when you're training and you're doing, like I told you, I do these Ironman events, have done 15, right? But these events, my best time, and by the way, type this in or type, yeah. So anybody know the distance of an Ironman? An Ironman is a type of triathlon. How far is the swim because triathlon, swim, bike, run. How far is the swim in an Ironman? Anybody? Yeah, 2.4 miles. That's exactly right. So it's about 10 laps around a track, except you're swimming it. Then you get off and you bike. Anybody want to guess how far you bike? It's a long way. Yeah, 112 miles. Kevin says 130. It's 112 miles. That's exactly right. That's from, if you're in Conway right now, it's biking to Little Rock and back, and maybe even back to Little Rock. I don't know. Yeah, that's crazy, Tucker. And then you're not done, because you get off the bike and then you run. Anybody want to guess how far you run? Yep. Well, it's a full marathon. It's 26 miles. So when you see, and I'll just type it in the chat, 140.6 sticker on somebody's car, that means that's an Ironman sticker. Some people will have fun and they'll put 0.0, 3.1, 13 point, but you see a sticker that says 140.6, that means Ironman. And there's also a half Ironman. You could do that. That's a 70.3 is what you call that. But that's half the distance. So you swim 1.2, you bike 56, and then you run 13. Half marathon. So when you're doing something that long, my best time is 10 and a half hours. 10 and a half hours, just to put it in perspective, which is a really long time. That's when I was fit and young. My more recent times is more on the order of 12 and 13, 14 hours. It's just aging and not training like I used to. But that's a long time. So you've got to eat food while you're out there. And some of the food is not going to be, we eat, and we'll go through this when we get to the chapter, energy gels, and you've probably seen some sports drink, and, but you can only do so much of that. So we do things like Rice Krispie treats. And, my go-to are Pop-Tarts, right? Some of the things that you might think unhealthy, if you weren't going out and exercising for 10 hours, or even when you're training, like 5 hours, 6 hours. Because to train for this, I mean, you've got basically gummy bears. Yeah, you can do, and they even have these like expensive, I call them expensive gummy bears, these sports beans. But yes, there's a lot of different things you can fuel with, and we can get all that later. But point is, there are times when you can have some simple sugar. Most of the population, they're not exercising much. So, you just the calories are just out of control, and they're just doing so much sugar. And even for me, and you see where I am now, but when I was your age, I weighed 200 pounds. I was really overweight, because I used to drink, and jaw's going to drop. I used to drink 2 liters of Coke, like regular Coke, a day. That's ridiculous to know how many calories are in 2 liters of Coke. And I used to eat what they call the brown bag special at Sonic by myself. They don't do this anymore, but a brown bag special was 2 burgers, 2 fries, and 2 drinks at Sonic. And I used to eat that by myself. But at some point, the switch flipped. And I'm saying all this because you may have somebody, it might even be you, you struggle with weight, or someone who's struggling. Don't give up on them. Because just one thing that you say to them, an encouragement, a word of encouragement, can go a long way. And sometimes people, I showed you the my plate where it's mainly carbohydrate. A lot of times people think they're doing well, and they still are not getting results. Years and years ago, I used to work and volunteered at what they had. UMS used to have a weight loss clinic, a medically supervised weight loss clinic. And I was working with a fella, and he was about 400 pounds, trying to lose weight. And he was so proud of himself one time. He's like, "You're not going to believe it. I'm doing so much better." I'm like, "You are? Well, tell me." Because he used to go through the McDonald's and get all these, I don't know, biscuits. I don't know how many biscuits he used to eat at McDonald's drive-through. He's like, "Instead of that, I've changed it out. I'm doing orange juice now for breakfast." I'm like, "Really? Cool. What do you, I'm changing my breakfast up. I'm drinking orange juice." I'm like, "That's great. How much you drinking?" He's like, "A gallon." One of those big gallon jugs, like you see a milk jug. He was drinking one of them for breakfast every morning. So he thinks that, okay, he's doing orange juice, he's getting his fruit in, that's better. But how many of you know that orange juice has pretty much all sugar, right? So sometimes we think we're doing well, and when you're working with people, when the reality is not doing as well as what they might think. And that's why there's us, right? That's why we have job security here. All right. So when we look at the complex variety, we know that there are going to be more bonds, and we have a fancy term for this that we call polysaccharides, right? So you have, if you have a mono or a di, those are still considered simple sugars, but polysaccharide is considered the complex variety. And within this polysaccharide, you have two versions, starch and fiber. And usually, and I've said this last time, and I'll say it again, when you eat a carbohydrate, unless you're doing like a soda or something like that, that's just liquid. If you're doing like a food like oatmeal is probably going to have a mixture of complex and some simple carbohydrate in them as well. So most of the foods you eat are going to have some complex and simple. And within the complex, they're also going to have, some of it's going to be starch, some of it's going to be fiber. Okay. And when you talk about this, right, the starch is the digestible form. And so the storage form of carbohydrate in plants is called starch, right? But this is, it's the digestible form, material that does get broken down as you digest it. And so what you're seeing here are the two most common types of starch. You've got amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is a straight chain, and amylopectin is a branch chain, but both of them have chains. This is just a straight chain, and this is a branch chain. And the reason I'm showing you this is that it's the amylopectin that, we majority of our starch is in the form of, about 80% in the form of amylopectin. And the reason I want to show you this is that we also have, because think about what has to happen. We're going to consume the starch. Our body's going to break these bonds down to simpler bonds, whether disaccharide, most of the time it's going to be monosaccharides. And then our body's going to store that carbohydrate, and we store that carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. We're going to get into that in just a minute. But the point I'm trying to make here is that glycogen looks just like, or relatively close to, amylopectin. It's branched. Glycogen is a branched form of stored carbohydrate. So we oftentimes, I will say starch, I will call it a plant polysaccharide. And our glycogen would be an animal polysaccharide that's stored in us, if that makes sense. And then with starch, you find it in most of your carbohydrates that you think of, like your breads, your pastas, your rice, all of these, your oatmeal. Oatmeal we tend to think of because it has fiber in it, right? And when you look at this, fiber is the material that doesn't get broken down. Now, there's some debate as far as I'm concerned on how much actually gets broken down and how much doesn't, because it's not, we're assuming that none of it gets broken down, although I'm not 100% certain on that. But we think of foods with fiber in them as oatmeal, fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes. Legumes are just a fancy word for bean, right? Are you familiar with that? And this is what we tend to look at when we go to the store, right? We want to get, with higher fiber, we want to get something that says 100% whole wheat. Okay. But here's what you might be surprised at. It may not have that much fiber. What's the only way to know, y'all, how much fiber's in this product? What do you got to do? You know this. What do you got to do to know how much fiber, really? Somebody type it in. What do you got to do? Yeah, you got to look at the nutrition label, exactly. And we're going to do that in just a second. And within this fiber, we got soluble and insoluble. And then, it's good for different things. We got that on the next slide, I believe. But the target for fiber is anywhere from 25 to 35 grams. Or you could, oftentimes we do it in per 1,000 calories. So 14 grams per. And I'll just say this is a rough guideline. Like for me, I probably need more fiber. Because, well, first off, if you're exercising more, then you're going to need more calories, which are going to inherently have more fiber if you're eating some of the carb foods. But people can tolerate different amounts, right? This is what is recommended just for health. So know that. And then if you look at the different types, like both types of fiber are going to aid digestion. It's the soluble fiber that we talk about reducing risk of these diseases like obesity and heart disease and obesity. It's the insoluble that's going to keep you regular, keep you going to the bathroom. That's not a problem for you youngsters, but for older folks like me, getting to the toilet is, especially before a race or an event, whew, that's important. And then the feeling of satiety. What's that mean? Somebody in the chat, what's satiety? Feeling of satiety. Anybody? Yeah, feeling full. That's exactly right. So you got this feeling of fullness. The fiber is supposed to fill us up. And so the only way to look, like you said, is to look. And when you might be surprised, like this says 100% stone ground whole wheat. So you think, oh, this has got a lot of fiber in it. And not much, 2 grams per slice, right? So if you eat a peanut butter and jelly, you're going to get 4 grams from the bread itself. You might even be surprised to see it's got more protein than you think. And this is something we can get into later, but oftentimes people don't realize how much protein are in the foods, as you know, because they think protein, you're eating meat and dairy and all this other, but some of the plant types of protein, it adds up over time for sure. And so you can't always look at the label, just think, oh, it's got a lot of fiber in it. Like this English muffin is, and you can say this is a good source of fiber. They're trying to promote all this stuff. It's got 5 grams, but this is considered like one muffin. So you really have 2 pieces of that muffin, right? So a little more. Same protein, but again, you really have to look on the label and just be smart. I mean, there's no perfect strategy on this, but just try to get more fiber. And I used to teach a basic nutrition class. I know all of you had that. You had to do a food recall, didn't you? How many days did you do? A 3-day or 7-day food recall? Just type it in the chat, 3 or 7. 3. Yeah, I usually do a 3. And so if you're looking at fiber and with all these nutrients, right? What I used to do is I'd have them, and I don't know if y'all did this, you'd do the recall and then you would keep that throughout the semester. So when you're talking about carbohydrates and fiber, I'd say, okay, pull out your food recall. How many days did you get the appropriate fiber? And if you got them on all 3 days, hey, boom, you're awesome. If you got it on 2 out of the 3, okay, not too bad. If you got it on 1 out of the 3, there's probably some work to be done. And if you didn't meet it at all, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board and make sure you're getting more fiber in. And you always see this stamp. How many of you are familiar with this on a product from the Whole Grains Council? This is deceiving. It's just to help identify foods that have whole grain. Like it says 13 grams or more per serving of whole grain. But here's the reality. Just because it's whole grain doesn't mean it has fiber in it. Whole grain just means it has all 3 parts of that grain. And what you'll see is like for each, like I think 13 grams of fiber, or sorry, 13 grams of whole grain, you may only be getting like, you can look this up, 3 grams of fiber maybe. So it's not 13. This is not how much fiber. This is whole grain. And it's scary how little fiber you get from these grams of whole grain. So just something, it's helpful because that means it is probably a healthier product, but at the same time, it's not the end all be all. So we talked about simple and complex carbohydrate. We said with the simple, we have mono and disaccharides, and they're all both called simple sugars. Found a lot of times in those convenience foods. We have the complex carbohydrate, which we call the polysaccharides. And within the polysaccharides, we got starches and fibers. And like I said, oftentimes when you're eating a carbohydrate, you're getting some complex, and you're also probably getting a little simple too. It's like if we were to go back and let's see if I screwed something up here. Yeah, sugar. See, look, so you're getting 3 grams of simple sugar in one slice or one English muffin, right? So you are getting some simple sugar in there too. Most of the time, it's not just one or the other. All right. And then the other form of carbohydrate is called glycogen. This is going to be so important as we move forward, is that this is the storage form of carbohydrate for us. Like I said, your body does its job. You eat the carbohydrate. Like, anybody have breakfast this morning? What did you have that had carbohydrate in it? Did you have some oatmeal? Did you have some veggies? Did you have, I don't know, what did you have for breakfast? Or maybe some of you didn't eat breakfast. Yeah, granola bar, it's going to have some carbohydrate in there. Okay, had some bread. So you're going to break that down. You through the process of digestion. You're going to break that down. And then a bagel, yeah, English muffin. So you're going to break that down to those simple bonds through digestion. And then you're going to, and the liver is going to be important because the liver gets the first shot at all your nutrients. It's going to send that out and it's going to store it, either store it in the liver or store it in the muscle. That's so you got to know that. Where is glycogen stored in the body? In the liver or the muscle? Mainly in the muscle. But the point of me drawing this is me hand drawing, which is, if you were in class, I might try to draw it on the board. But basically, you've got all these glucose molecules that are chained together. It looks like that amylopectin. I just had a little more space here. So I just wanted to show you that. So branch structure similar to starch, and particularly that amylopectin. And I'm going to set this up. And then when we get into the carbohydrate chapter, we're really going to dive deeper into this. So there are 3 places where we have this glucose or carbohydrate. And on the order of about, everybody's different, anywhere from about 2,000 to 2,500 calories of stored glycogen, depending on the size of the person. So I'm just making these numbers up. I probably could go a little lower, but let's say we got 500 grams of carbohydrate in the muscle. We've got a little bit of glucose in the blood, and then we've got 150 grams in the liver. And when we get into the carbohydrate chapter, I'll show you how this plays out, because what ends up happening as you exercise, especially when you exercise intensely or for a long period of time, the muscle glycogen starts to be depleted, and then we've got to start pulling glucose from our blood, and so everything's moving in this direction. And then we've got to break down liver glycogen to help support the blood, and then eventually the liver glycogen runs out. And that's when you may have heard of that term bonking or hitting the wall, right? Anybody heard that, like an endurance event? That's what that means. You run out of glycogen. And so here's just an example. For a test, you will need to know this math. The simple math for our first test is just around looking at a nutrition label and knowing, hey, half a cup of oatmeal has 150 calories, and we know that there are 4 calories per gram, right? You knew that. This is not new news to you. So you do the math on that, and that comes up to be 108 calories from carbohydrate. And if you divide that, then it gives you the percentage, right, of calories that are coming from carbohydrate. And if you look at, this is a picture of an oatmeal from my kitchen, from my cupboard. It has about 4 grams of fiber, which you'd imagine that, right? This is fiber, this is carbohydrate. So if you do the math, that's 72% of calories. Can everybody feel good about doing that simple math? I hope so, because that's the math you'll have to do. When we get into the second chapter, even though we're going to cover energy expenditure and calculations in the next chapter, I'm not going to expect you to, I want to make sure that you're good at doing those calculations before putting it on a test. So that'll be for the second exam. All right. So that's what I wanted to introduce around carbohydrates. So now let's talk about protein. Type in the chat what your favorite type of protein source is. I want to hear. I want to see in the chat. You have a bunch of different ones here. Like my wife is over here. You can't see her. She is making her breakfast because we're early. Okay, I see deer. Oh, my wife loves deer. She was going to say that was her favorite. But she is making every morning, like clockwork, she makes an omelet. So she has the eggs. 1 egg omelet or 2 egg omelet? 2 egg omelet. Yeah. And she throws some veggies in there, and she's got some meat in there, and some cheese, and I see on her plate over there, she's got some green beans. Okay, so Austin likes steak, Tammy likes beef, you got beef steak, yeah, chicken. Okay, there's just a lot of different sources. Some of you might like plant-based sources. Like I said, you might do some tofu or something, and that'll work. It can work. But what makes protein different than the rest? And we have thousands of proteins. Somebody type in the chat, what makes protein different than carbohydrate and fat? What does it have on it? Somebody in the structure of it. Yeah. it's got nitrogen, right? It's got nitrogen. Yeah, so it sure does, versus the other, right? Because we had CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen for carbohydrate. We got this nitrogen group, and that's how you differentiate it. How many of you been in a class where you had to memorize these amino acids, right? Because we said we have 20 amino acids. 9 of these are essential. How many of you had anybody been in a class you had to memorize these? Yes. Oh, bless your heart, Gabby. Yep. You will not have to do that. I don't have students do that in my classes. I don't see that it's beneficial. The important thing to note is that each one of these amino acids, they are similar in that they all have an amino group or a nitrogen group. And then they have a side chain. The side chain is what makes them different. Okay. They have a carboxyl group, a nitrogen group, and they have a side chain. It's a side chain that interacts with other amino acids. It's the one that differentiates them. So alanine, this is alanine right here. That's the reason I got it in red. It's the simplest of all the amino acids. You've probably seen these where they have aromatic. I mean, they have rings. It gets really complicated. You're not going to have to know that for this class. Just know we have 20, 9 of them are essential, which again, going back to what does that mean? It means you have to get it through your diet. There's some interconversion of these, but you've got to get it through your diet. And why is this important? Well, for all of our different hormones, like this is insulin. You've probably heard of that before. We can talk a little bit about it later. We won't get too in depth on the hormones and things here in class, but the organization is important, how these are structured, because if you remember back from your A&P, structure affects function. And you can see that you have all these different amino acids lined up, and you get their names here. And this insulin has 2 chains, 30 amino acid chain, a 21 amino acid chain, and they're connected with sulfur groups. But the bottom line is, if you get one of these amino acids out of sequence, guess what happens to the protein? Yeah, Hannah says, unfortunately, I had to memorize these. Yes. You get one out of sequence, the protein stops functioning. Yeah, it stops functioning. And that's a good point. Hannah mentions a term. Have you heard of this called denatures? Basically, denatures just means when you put heat on a protein, like my wife's cooking these eggs, which we can talk about this later. Egg is considered like the perfect protein source, because if you incubate that egg, what happens? If you incubate that egg, you get what? You get a baby chicken, don't you? Yeah, you get a baby chicken. But if you do like my wife and you crack that egg and you put it on some heat, you get breakfast, right? So just know that these proteins, if you can manipulate them, and for instance, and I don't know if I do on the next slide, if one amino acid is out of sequence, then it loses its function, because structure affects function. And these amino acids, I'm not going to get, proteins can be organized in different, like an alpha helix or a beta sheet are examples if you've studied this before. And an alpha helix are these coils. It's kind of like if you've ever been in a house with a stairwell that's winding. You got one rung that attaches to the next at the bottom, the next step, and they're attached together. And then the next step attaches down below rung. It's just a winding staircase type of situation. But here's what happens. This is an example of sickle cell. This is where the red blood cell stops functioning in people who have one amino acid out of sequence. Tell me that's not going to affect their life. So it's pretty important. And yes, this side chain is what interacts. It has an electrical charge. It differentiates it from another. And when we connect these amino acids, we call those peptide bonds. And then I think if you get like 100 amino acids or more, it's considered a protein. So there are different levels, but again, I'm not going to ask you that on a test. Just understand what proteins do, what, that there are 20 amino acids and all the things around that. And here's the interesting thing around amino acids that's like in carbohydrate, we either store them in the muscle or the liver. With amino acids, we store them in a little bit, small portions in all your cells, and we call those amino acid pools. Because these amino acids, as you know, their main job is to build, repair, and they turn over so much that you have to have them in all little bit small amounts in all our cells versus where you store it all in like two places, like you do with carbohydrate, or like when we talk about fat, you're going to store mainly most of your fat in your adipose tissue. So it's a little different in that sense. And while I've got you on this slide, and we'll come back to this, this is how you typically see a cell, is that it's round. Just know that oftentimes the cells we talk about in here are skeletal muscle cells. And these skeletal muscle cells aren't round like that. They're long and cylindrical. We'll come back around to that when we get particularly in chapter 3, looking at the energy systems. And with the energy systems, the most important, we'll point this out now and we'll come back to it. The two most important parts of this cell for energy production are this little fella here, right? The mitochondria. What do they call the mitochondria, somebody? You probably learned this in high school. Type in the chat. What do you call this little mitochondria? Powerhouse. That's right. We're going to show you why we call it that. We won't go too in depth, but this is where all the aerobic processes happen. So I mentioned this last time, and I didn't mention as we went through today, but remember, carbohydrate is the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically. If it's the first time I've said it, I'm going to write it down. Carbohydrate is the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically. Anaerobic means without oxygen, right? When you talk about using fat, when you talk about using protein, that has to happen in this little mitochondria here, okay? And then the other important part for energy is what I just described, is that the cell is mainly fluid. And the process of breaking down carbohydrate happens in the fluid portion of the cell, the cytoplasm, right? And that's what they're saying, the cytoplasm. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. The aerobic processes occur here in the mitochondria. And not that you can't take like an end product of carbohydrate and shuttle it into the mitochondria. We'll get into all that later. But just know from a cell, these are the most important parts, the mitochondria and the cytoplasm. And then I do this on some slides or some sections, like just to give you an idea of how much protein is in some of the foods you eat. Because like I said, a lot of times students think that, you only find protein in things like dairy, like cheese and milk and yogurt. And then obviously in the protein sources like fish and eggs and meat and nuts. Just know that this is a good one to write down, just for practical purposes, is that anytime you eat 1 ounce of meat, it's 7 grams of protein. 1 ounce of meat. So when you go to, where's your favorite steakhouse? Anybody? Where do you like to eat steak? Do you go to Logan's, Roadhouse, Colton's? And where else do you eat steak? Where's your favorite steakhouse? What's the smallest steak that they have? Your house, as she cooks. What's the smallest steak that you can get when you go to like Colton's or Logan's or one of these other steakhouses? What's usually the smallest? Yeah, 6 ounces. Yeah, that's right. So think about that. If you eat a 6 ounce steak, multiply that times 7, that's 42 grams of protein right there. So it's probably more, we tend to get more protein than we think we do. And especially because we get it in some of the breads and the rices and the noodles and even the vegetables, the broccoli, 2 to 3 grams. So the important thing to note here is, yes, with the dairy, you're going to get 8 to 10 grams. With the meat and beans, you're going to get 7. With grains, you're going to get 2 to 5. And then with vegetables, you're going to get some 2 to 3. You're not going to get much with the fruit, and you're not going to get hardly any, 0 with the oil. So just be aware of that. Nuts is one to always talk about. They're always a good source of healthy fat and protein. You just have to be careful because anybody know how many calories just in what are your favorite nuts? Somebody type in the chat. What's your favorite type of nut? Anybody? Almond? Yeah, okay. Usually that's what people say. Almonds, cashews. Yeah, pecans. I love pecans too. Whew, haven't had any pecans lately. I love them. But like 1 almond has 7 calories. And 1 serving of almonds is about 24 almonds, something like that. It's not that many. So you can have a handful, you just can't have multiple handfuls because they're going to have lots of calories. Just have to be careful because like it goes back to what I said earlier. Sometimes people think they're doing right, doing well, but when you see what they're doing, they're like, whoa, just way too many calories. All right. So let's talk about this. I think you already know with protein, we get 4 calories per gram. If we look at that same half a cup of oatmeal, which you might be surprised. How many of you did this? You this morning, you just took one of those little packets and you opened it up and you put it in your bowl and you're like, whoa, that's it? Half a cup? It's not that much, right? But you might be surprised to find that in half a cup of oatmeal, there's 6 grams of protein. So it's a pretty good protein source, 24 of the 150, so 16% of total calories. And we're going to come back around to, and this is a nutrition 101 thing as well, and understanding what percent of calories, and I should have probably had this already in here. I'll do it here shortly. What percent of calories come from, and maybe you should just, maybe you know, what percent of calories should be coming from carbohydrate, what percent of calories should be coming from protein, and what percentage of calories should be coming from fat. I'll jump the gun a little bit. Anybody want to type in, give it a shot? If not, no problem. Anybody want to take a shot? Okay, that's close, Vincent. I love it. 55 to 65% carbs. Okay, that's close. Okay, 25% carbs. Oh, wow. Okay, Jonathan, that is super low. Let me get to this here shortly, but I'll tell you now. I'll go ahead and tell you now. 40, and write this down, 45 to 65% of calories from carbs, 10 to 35% of calories from protein, and 20 to 35% of calories from fat. That's what is recommended when you look at my plate. And again, those percentages, 65% for most people is probably too much, pretty high, unless you're exercising a lot. Here are some of the top contributors of protein, beef, poultry, those are no surprises. Bread's in there too. That might be quite a surprise, or pasta. We just love our breads and bread's going to have some protein in there. I didn't see anybody type in ham as one of their favorite. Pork. Oh my goodness. I love some pork. We have been digging pork lately. Here in California, there's lots of tacos to be had. Yeah, so the numbers, I've got it on a slide, Blake, but I'll give it to you. 45 to 65% of calories from carbohydrate, 10 to 35% of calories from protein, and 20 to 35% of calories from fat. I've got it in the next, at the end of this section, I believe. But when we talk about protein in general, we think of protein as muscle, right? Muscle tissue and cardiac and smooth muscle, because there are 3 types of muscle. And then structural proteins like tendons and ligaments. And I know I got a lot of exercise science students in here and athletic training students. Structural proteins like what does a tendon do? Somebody type in the chat. Some of you type in what a tendon does, and somebody else type in what a ligament does. Type it in. What does a tendon do and what does a ligament do? Those are all structural proteins. Help support our muscles. Nobody knows. Oh, come on. Oh, my athletic training. Don't make me have to go tell Dr. Gallagher and Dr. Bringer. You could, ligament connects bone to bone. Thank you, Kevin. Yes. And a tendon connects bone to what? Come on, type it in. There you go. Muscle. Thank you. But that's what we think of when we think of protein. But protein does so many other things. Get ready for this. It makes all our hormones, or a lot of our hormones. We have amino acid derived hormones, things like I showed you one, insulin, glucagon are going to be important. Epinephrine, which is your fight or flight hormone, and norepinephrine. Those are examples of amino acid derived hormones. We also have antibodies, for immune function. Those are made from protein. We have hemoglobin, right? Somebody in the chat, what does hemoglobin do? What's hemoglobin's job? What does it carry? Yeah, oxygen, right? Your red blood cell. Now, lipoproteins, right? You've probably heard of HDL, LDL, right? It's lipid, but it's carried in this protein shell. Protein is important for maintaining fluid and electrolyte balance. And then way down at the end of the list is energy. And if we have to, Yep. Oxygen in the bloodstream. That's exactly right. And then if we have to, if there's a situation where we don't take in any calories, our body can use protein for energy and convert that to glucose. It's a big fancy word. We may mention it later, but it's called gluconeogenesis. Anybody heard of that big fancy word? It just means making glucose from other sources. Glucose, new, beginnings. But our body doesn't like to do that. In a situation, I'll just mention it briefly. Like if you've had somebody that had an eating disorder, or maybe they had anorexia and they're not taking any calories, then that's what you're going to see. And the effects are called muscle wasting. Have you heard that? I have examples I could share. I won't do this now on this call, but there'll be a time when I'll share your example of me working with some disordered eating patients, and some things that, it's just eye-opening when you see that basically they just become skin and bones. And then eventually, over a long, long period of time, it affects the most important muscle in your body. Anybody want to guess what that is? What's the most important muscle in your body? Yeah, okay, but heart. There you go. Yeah, heart. And so once you get to that point with these eating disordered patients, you can't. It's hard to undo that damage. But again, this is very rare. Another time when you might use protein is when we're doing these long Ironman competitions. When you're out there exercising for 10 hours, 12 hours, 14, you might be using, because typically in a fed state, you're using about 5 to 10% of your calories from protein. I mean, you're using a little bit. But when you exercise for a long period of time, you can't keep up with those calories. You're burning more than you're taking in. And so you just have to use more protein. Or there are events, I know this is going to shock some of you, maybe not, but there are events that are way longer than an Ironman. Anybody ever heard of an ultra run? Where, ultra is anything over 26.2 miles, but there are, like in Arkansas, there's a 100-mile run coming up in October. So it's the Arkansas Traveler 100, where these folks run 100 miles in the forest. And there are even longer races than that. Out here in California, we're a couple of hours from Lake Tahoe. They have the Tahoe, I think, 200, where they actually run 200 miles around the lake, or some kind of ridiculous. I don't know if they run twice around the lake, or I don't know what they do, but we also out here have the original 100-miler, which is called Western States in California. But people do some extreme stuff. We'll get to that later. And then let's wrap this up here, looking at the what we call those the macros, right? The lipids or fats. This is the nutrient that's most confusing to folks. People understand carbohydrate, they understand the idea around protein, but fat it's definitely the most concentrated form of food energy, and it's the most demonized. Like, how many of you feel like you're running from this cupcake? And the cupcake has a lot of sugar in it, but it's also got a lot of fat too. But there's definitely room for that in our diet, because fat is important. It's going to provide us with a lot of energy, but it also helps as a shock absorber. Okay, within your organs, it helps for insulation to keep you warm. It helps. A lot of students don't know this, but if you studied the cell membrane, and we have billions of cells in our body, right? These cells have membranes that surround them, and they're made of fat. They're fat that's contained in these cell membranes. And then we also need things like fat-soluble vitamins, right? We need vitamins that are going to be stored and absorbed with fat. And here's why a lot of us like fat, because it makes our food smell good. It makes our food taste good. We had some tacos last night, actually, and we just kept the fat in there. I did anyway. It just makes it taste good. Tenderness. And here's another overlooked property of fat. It helps fill you up. We tend to think of fiber and carbohydrate, but the truth is fat and even protein are going to probably do a better job of filling you up than fiber. And if you've studied this, you know that when we talk about, this is what starts to get confusing for students, is that you have different types of lipids. You have triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Let's play a fun game Which of these three provide the body with energy? Two of them do not. One of them does. Which one? Which one provides the body with energy? Somebody. When you eat that big, healthy cheeseburger that you see in a picture, yeah, triglycerides, good. That's exactly right. Phospholipids and sterols don't provide energy, but they have and serve important functions. And we'll just briefly touch on those because most importantly, we're going to focus on the triglycerides, the fat. And when we store these fats as triglycerides in the adipose tissue, what it looks like, these triglycerides basically have a 3-carbon glycerol backbone, and the fatty acid are these portions here, the 3 fatty acid, 1, 2, 3, triglycerides. And these fatty acids, this is where what gets people confused, like when you go to the doctor and you get your blood work done and they have, you get your results. Anybody been recently? You get your total cholesterol, you get your HDL, you get your LDL, you get some of that's not the fat you use for energy, right? Those are actually made from sterols, a different type of fat. But you also get something on your lab report called triglycerides. And that's basically how much fat that you have floating around in your blood, which is an indication of how much fat you have on your body. My wife worked at a construction company for a while, and she would do wellness testing, and they would take the blood from some of their employees and they would spin it, and the blood would almost look like dark. Here she goes. She says gravy. It looked like gravy because there's so much fat and triglyceride floating around in their blood. That's not good. Normal triglycerides, you want it under 150 milligrams per deciliter. And again, you're not going to be asked to know this on a test, but there would be like what, 2,000 milligrams floating around their bloodstream. Now, maybe they just ate, which could cause that. But in most cases, if you eat right before you come in and test, obviously it's going to affect your blood sugar. It's going to affect some of these other metrics, but most of the time it's just because they just ate crappy foods most of the time. And then these fatty acids, and when I say fatty acid, I'm talking about this part, because essentially what happens is you take these fatty acids and you break them apart. So when you take this fatty acid off, you have what's called a diglyceride and a free fatty acid. And this is the fatty acid. When we say using fat for energy, it's this long carbon chain of fatty acids. So that's how these fatty acids are differentiated, by the length of the chain and the saturation. And this. And again, as I'm going through this is why people get so confused around triglycerides versus total cholesterol. The cholesterol is a type of sterol. It has nothing to do with the energy piece. Okay. So this is an example of a saturated fat. This is a long chain. This is a 16-carbon fatty acid. And all the hydrogens, all the carbons are full of hydrogen. So it's considered saturated. All the parking spots, if you want to call it. My wife, like I said, she used to try to describe this to her employees, and it would be, you're driving around the Walmart parking lot looking for an empty spot, but there are none. Well, that's a saturated fat. And then you have unsaturated, which means there is an empty parking spot or two. You basically have a double bond. So when you have one double bond, it's considered a mono unsaturated. And you have more than one double bond, it's considered a poly unsaturated. And hopefully that makes sense in that we tend to think of the unsaturated variety as the healthier version. I mean, again, this is another place we could have debates as far as that goes. Because if you're exercising and doing a lot, you could probably get away with eating more saturated fat and not have a serious consequence. But point is, to make this practical, I'm going to show you this. This is what it looks like on the skillet, because this is where the rubber meets the road. When you look at saturated versus unsaturated, somebody tell me saturated is what at room temperature? Blank at room temperature. What are you gonna say? Saturated fat is what? Yeah, solid. And so that's what you see here. This right here is coconut oil. If you've looked, coconut oil is like 98% saturated fat. And then if it's totally and mainly unsaturated, what's it going to be at room temperature? It's going to be liquid. That's exactly right. So what you see here is this is butter. And butter's got a pretty good mix of saturated as well as unsaturated fat. You might be surprised to find that. And then here are things like your olive and canola oils, which is pretty much all liquid, right? But your coconut oil is your saturated fats, your tropical oil. These tropical oils have more saturated fats in them. So that's what I wanted to say around triglycerides. That's when you say burning fat for energy, using fat for energy, it's the triglyceride, and specifically the fatty acid off of that triglyceride. And there's a process, and we can talk about it later, but it's not as easy to get the energy from a fat, because you can see all the bonds there. Oh my gosh, right? You got to break down, because for energy, you got to break down all these bonds individually. And actually with fat, what you're doing is you're going to break them down 2 at a time. I mean, we will, because you're going to use fat. Are you going to use fat anaerobically or aerobically? Type in the chat. Aerobically or anaerobically? How are you going to use fat for fuel? You got a 50-50 shot. Oh, aerobically. That's exactly right. Yeah. Remember, carbohydrate, the only nutrient that can be broken down anaerobically. Okay. All right, here we go. So I'll finish this up, just these 2 other parts, because this won't take long. When you look at phospholipids, again, they do not provide the body energy. So we're not going to really spend any time on them other than to say, this is where we mainly find our cell membranes. You find fat, these phospholipids, right? You got the phosphorus head. Anybody remember studying this? And sometimes I get it wrong here, right? You get the phosphorus head, and you got the fatty acid tail, and the phosphorus head is water loving. It's hydrophilic, and then the fatty acid tail is hydrophilic, so they flip. And so you got the inside of the cell, let's say, and this is the outside of the cell. And we also find some phospholipids in some of the salad dressings as emulsifiers, but for us, we're not using phospholipids really for energy. It's the triglycerides. And then sterols are totally different. This is what we've used to form cholesterol. It comes from sterols. And this is why we were talking about total and HDL and LDL. Totally different look, right? This actually is a ring structure. The sterols are. And this is also important for us to know that sterols produce our hormones. We have some hormones that are amino acid or protein derived. I mentioned those like insulin and glucagon and epinephrine, but we also have some of these, what we call non-steroid hormones, we got steroid hormones, like cortisol would be an example of that. And they have different effects, but just know that sterols help to make hormones. So that's the biggest player. And then as we go through, I'm not going to spend any time on this other than it's kind of a hot topic, essential fatty acids, right? Have you heard? I'm not going to get into, you got linoleic and linolenic acid, but you hear this a lot. The most important thing to note is, right, what are you supposed to eat once a week? Couple times a week if you can, to help improve your brain. Yeah, fish, yeah, seafood, helps decrease your risk of heart disease and improve your brain function and vision and decrease inflammation. And there's a whole thing around that. And so I'm not going to dive deep into that at all. Just know that there's these essential fatty acids, which means what? We got to get it from food. Our body can't make these essential fatty acids. And then if you had to look, oh yeah, fat's our favorite. Dairy, it could range like depending on what you're eating. Ice cream, heavy cream. Anybody use heavy cream? Like, quick story here, and we'll wrap this thing up, is that when I first started drinking coffee, now I'm addicted. My wife hates it, but I've never been to Starbucks before. So I went to Starbucks and, got my coffee, and I put the cream in there, or maybe I did it at home first before I went to Starbucks, but I bought the cream and I put it in there, and I'm like, man, this coffee is the most amazing thing ever, until I looked on the label of the heavy cream bottle, and it's like 100 calories per teaspoon or something ridiculous. It's so many calories. I was having like an 800 calorie coffee. No wonder. It tasted so good. There's so much fat in there. And you probably heard of people doing low carb or keto where they're doing the bulletproof coffee with cream and butter and all those things. That could work for some people, but most of us won't do that. Cheese is going to have got some protein, but lots of fat as well. And then meat's going to have quite a bit as and whether you cut off the fat from your chicken or you eat the skin, that's going to affect how much fat you get. And you might be surprised in grains like pasta. Ideally, packaged foods like crackers, they're going to, just to help preserve them, they're going to have some extra fat in there. But pasta, when you add some butter in there, like butter on the pasta or butter on the bread, can add. And then French fries. And then if you're looking, so this is fruit, avocados. How many of you like avocados? Anybody love some avocados? Yeah, I'm here in California where it's the avocado mecca. I used to do seminars where I go around and teach sports nutrition. Maybe I mentioned this last time, but 6-hour seminars. And I came to California one time and they were telling me all the different ways that they would eat avocados. Like we tend to just cut them up and put them on a salad. But like last night, we had some avocados. We put them on our tacos. But they do some crazy stuff. Yes, they do some crazy stuff where they will take the pit. And so you cut the avocado in half. And with the big ones, they'll put some protein in the little divot, right, in the area. And so they eat the avocado just as it is. So you're getting the healthy fat and you're getting some protein in there too. Or avocado ice cream. It's all kinds of craziness. But to wrap this thing up, again, I've said this several times, just know you get 9 calories per gram. Okay. And there's not much fat in oatmeal, 2.5 grams of fat. So that's 23 of the 150 calories, or 15% of calories from fat. And with that, and I thought I had a slide, but I don't see it anywhere. I'm going to see if I can look real quick. Yeah, so this is just to reference what, and we're going to finish this up like in the next 1 minute. I mentioned this, so I'm sure, can y'all still see my screen? Type in the, yes? Yeah, okay, so this is what the recommendations are when you're looking at your macronutrients. Just so it's in your, just know I'm always going to support you. I've got the videos that will help. I also have PDFs of the chapters that will help. So with that, we will spend next class. We'll touch the vitamins and minerals and water. We won't do a whole lot there. And then we will jump into the exercise basics. Okay. At this point, I will stop sharing and we will call it for today. What do you say? Appreciate everybody hanging in with me. And if you do have questions about content you can't find or help you need, please reach out. I'm available. And with that being said, y'all have a great rest of your day. Any questions before we go? Give me a thumbs up if it was doable. Is this going to work? And again, at some point, like I said, if you've looked at these videos, you probably know that everything that I mentioned for the most part is in the videos. So, but if I get this push like, hey, we want to be face-to-face live every morning, later in the semester, and it's all well and good right now, but when it gets to be, end of October, November, you might be like, oh, we need the day off. Or maybe what we do is we plan some activity for one of the days where you're working on calculations or we're doing some hands-on stuff instead of me lecturing. All right. Sounds good. Y'all rock and roll. And this should be uploaded within the next 30, 40 minutes or hour. And again, y'all are here, so you may not want to watch, but you can if you want to. All right. Plenty of opportunities. All right. See you. Have a great day. Bye.